Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Hormone Hackers, the podcast, which is where we discuss all things hormone related, everything from thyroid, adrenals, female reproductive hormones, and all that entails, all the good stuff. And with the goal that we each become our own little hormone hacker. The idea is that you gain a better understanding of your body and what it's trying to tell you so that you can make a more educated decision about your own health or who you decide to work with. So yay, back together again. There are so many things that I always want to talk about, and I think I kind of get a little bit strung up in my head about it. So today I do want to kind of, I think over the next several podcasts, just kind of weave in different glands within the endocrine system. So I want to talk about thyroid. I want to talk about adrenals and thyroid together, and also the role that they play when it comes to reproductive hormones. And in particular, because this is such a hot topic now everywhere you look on social media, which is perimenopause, menopause, and everybody think they're, in it at a very young age, which is just really not the case. And I want to kind of highlight what I think it really is all about. So we'll just get started. So kind of first off, let's talk a little bit about, thyroid and thyroid hormone basics, and kind of have a revisit of how this endocrine system is regulated. So I think the first place to start is the fact that TSH is not your thyroid, people. When someone says, oh, my thyroid's fine, or, oh, they tested my thyroid and my blah, blah, blah. It's always a lot of times just looking at TSH. Well, fun fact, TSH is actually a pituitary signal and not quote unquote your thyroid. It's a signal that goes to your thyroid from the anterior pituitary. But one thing I wanted to bring up with that is that the thyroid is not the only thing that causes an elevation of TSH. So I got to take you back for just a second so that you can kind of understand this, because there is this very, very important feedback loop. So a little reminder is that everything's regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary, and when it comes to our endocrine system. So meaning the hypothalamus is assessing hormone production, different things that are going on. Based on that information, sends out either releasing or inhibiting signal to the anterior pituitary, and then signals go out downstream to the appropriate glands. Now, I think we spend way too much time thinking that everything is very simple, very isolated, and the fact is there is an interaction within the pituitary hormones, and they can rise for more than one reason. In particular, let's talk about TSH. So if we were thinking of this just from a thyroid point of view, we would get a release of thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, which would stimulate TSH. And then we think, oh, it's going to tell the thyroid gland what to do. The thyroid gland does it, sends that communicating signal back up to the hypothalamus. But the fact is, when the hypothalamus sends out TRH and it hits the anterior pituitary, TSH, ACTH, and prolactin, all three will elevate, which means depending on how that response goes can kind of have an impact on what happens. Now, what I want you to hear in that is the TSH and the ACTH in particular, because adrenocorticotropin hormone is specific for the adrenal glands. Yet, I always say the adrenals and thyroid go together. So that means if thyrotropin releasing hormones going to the anterior pituitary, TSH and ACTH both get stimulated. That should tell you that wherever the thyroid goes, the adrenals go. Wherever the adrenals go, the thyroid's got to go. Now, kind of this little nuance in there is the prolactin. Prolactin will also elevate in with the other group of those pituitary hormones. This becomes very important because when prolactin goes up, it can have a suppressive effect on FSH and LH. And if FSH is suppressed, it has a suppressive effect on growth hormone. So in that, you can see in this response of what's going on, we're just talking about thyroid right now, with ACTH, so adrenals have got to kick in. If prolactin goes up, and just going up a little bit and coming back down is not a big deal because it's not an overly lingering pituitary hormone. But if these factors keep happening, meaning, stimulation going to the thyroid, prolactin can have an impact on our reproductive hormones, in particular because of its effect on FSH and LH. So I think that's really important when you're looking at part of, well, how does thyroid affect my cycle? How does thyroid maybe impact, my transition from perimenopause to menopause? This is part of what goes on. Now, another important one in there is the adrenals. So ACTH, when that elevates, it's going to stimulate the production of cortisol and DHEA. Now, before you get too lost in all of that, we're going to go back to the hypothalamus. So now the hypothalamus says, ooh, we're under stress. We thought stress, we felt stress happened, blood sugar dropped too low, not sleeping, something happened. So now in this feedback loop, we get corticotropin releasing hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary, which we would like to think is just CRH, goes to anterior pituitary, ACTH, and then the adrenals do their job. Except when corticotropin releasing hormone reaches the anterior pituitary, it will stimulate TSH, ACTH, and prolactin. Okay, did you get that? Did you get the fact that whether this is thyroid or this is an adrenal ask, the same three pituitary hormones are going to elevate? And that is so, so important to get. And kind of like, so if adrenals need help, everybody kind of comes to the rescue. If it's thyroid, the thyroid and the adrenals are always together. They're like each other's ride or die. So on one hand, I can't have a conversation about the thyroid without talking about the adrenals just a little bit, even though I want to talk about them more later. And then of course we got this other component of prolactin coming into the mix, which then in turn can have this suppressive effect on some of the other pituitary hormones that regulate our cycle, help us feel better as we transition from perimenopause to menopause. Now, the thing of it is that the idea of our endocrine system primarily is this negative feedback loop. So the negative feedback loop means if the hypothalamus says we need more hormones, goes to the anterior pituitary, say, hey, you got to talk to everybody. We got to get more hormones going. So the anterior pituitary sends out its signal to get the glands to do their job. If they do their job, then there's no longer an ask, right? It kind of quiets down. It's kind of like if you're the boss or you have a child and you're like, hey, I need you to go do this. They go do it. Everything's really nice. Everything's very kosher. Everybody's happy. Or you say, hey, I need you to do this, whatever this is. And I'm like, no, I don't want to. Or they just don't do it. Most of us are going to get louder. The boss is going to yell. If you're a parent, which I am, yes, there are times when I yelled at my children because they weren't doing what I asked them to do. If they would just simply do it, I would have been happy. So kind of when you think about that, that's kind of like where the hypothalamus is. If the gland's not responding, then the signal keeps sending out the signal. And so let's say if it's thyroid, it keeps sending out TRH to make TSH go up. But don't forget, it's never just going to be TSH. ACTH and prolactin will go as well. I want you to keep that in mind. Now, let's say that the thyroid is not producing enough thyroid hormones. So then we go, okay, I've got elevated TSH. That's a good one I can see, because the problem with hypothalamic hormones is that they're very, very fast. So they're too hard to catch as of right now in our testing, but it's much easier to test pituitary hormones either in blood or saliva. So let's say it makes sense that the thyroid, in particular, TSH is most sensitive to our T4. So our total T4, our free T4. If there's not enough, then the signal comes in and says, hey, we need to make more. Now, this is the challenge. We're looking to see if the signal is appropriate, right? If we're not making enough thyroid hormones, we should have an elevated TSH. Makes sense. But then you have to go, okay, this is not the excuse to jump to synthroid, levothyroxine, armor thyroid, or whatever. I would be looking at, okay, well, why isn't the thyroid gland able to make its thyroid hormones? That's where you look at the building blocks. Do we have enough iodine? Does it show iodine deficient? Because iodine is like a key nutrient for making our thyroid hormones. In fact, you can't make it without it. So, and we also know that iodine is stored in 3 key parts of the body. It's stored in the thyroid gland, it's stored in the breast tissue, and it's also stored in the ovaries, or, we could say gonads, but ovaries for women. So that could be one thing. Do we have enough iodine? A good indication of that is if total T4 is low, that can be a strong indication that there's not enough iodine. But that could also indicate that we're not getting enough protein to make our hormones, or we might be getting enough protein, but we're not digesting, being able to utilize it. We also need our B vitamins. We need zinc. We need magnesium. We need vitamin A, vitamin E. We need this complete nutritional support for the thyroid to make its hormones. And then also what's really crucial, because the thyroid stores selenium, it's the highest storage of selenium anywhere in the body, because it is the enzyme that converts T4 to free T3, which is our active thyroid hormone, is a selenium-based enzyme. So that's kind of the other thing that we want to look at. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times, most labs or most doctors will just look at TSH and maybe free T4 and just kind of make an assumption from there whether you're okay or not. Well, you could have adequate free T4 and even TSH could still look normal, providing it's not a stressor, not a stress response that we're talking about, but in the thyroid itself. But if you're not converting to free T3, which is the active thyroid hormone, you might have some of the feelings of hypothyroidism. Now, part of that could be that you're converting to reverse T3, which is inactive, and that is due to prolonged and high stress, high cortisol, maybe heavy metals, which would also create inflammation and stress within the system. It is really important. You can look at T3 uptake and total T3, but to me, the critical ones are certainly free T3, reverse T3, free T4, total T4, as well as the TSH. And then we can always look at antibodies, and we'll talk about autoimmune later. But if we don't have enough of the active, again, thyroid hormone, which is free T3, we have to go, okay, is this a problem with hormone conversion due to, say, like a selenium deficiency or some other things? Is it an issue coming back to the liver? Because that's where the majority of hormone conversion happens for the thyroid. About 60% or a little bit more happens in the liver. And that gives us insight into what's going on. In general, the feelings of, fatigue, maybe weight gain, dry skin, issues with blood sugar. We might also, our metabolism, in general, can be a little bit wonky. Dry eyes. There's just a lot of things that can kind of show up. One big telltale is the loss of the outer 1/3 eyebrow, which is kind of unique to the thyroid. So you could have some of these symptoms that could be related to thyroid, but then I do challenge, okay, well, if the thyroid's not doing its job, then we want to figure out why. Is it that it's too tired? Is it that we got all these nutrients coming in, but they're not bioavailable, meaning it's a gut issue? Or does it need things that are nourishing, tropho-restorative? Herbs like bladderwrack, ashwagandha, even bacopa can also be really beneficial for optimal thyroid function with those nutrients. And it's not about just jumping in and I'm going to overtake what your thyroid should be doing by shoving a bunch of T4 at someone and then kind of hoping for the best. It's about achieving optimal function. And I do think that that's really where wellness lives, is restoring optimal function. Because essentially when someone has a functioning thyroid gland, even if it's maybe not as strong as we want it to be and not always listening, right? But when you give what the body should be making or what a gland should be making, over time, you actually make that gland weaker because you're taking away its job. It's not having, to produce all this T4, which is about 90% of what the thyroid gland does. It doesn't have to work as hard. Now, when you give T4, because TSH is so sensitive to it, yes, you're going to make the TSH look better, but doesn't actually mean that you're correcting anything. And in fact, I would argue that you're not correcting anything at all. So take a second when you're looking at that to try to have a better understanding of what's going on. And we want to look at all of these other nutrients that are necessary for optimal thyroid function. But remember, TSH does not equal thyroid. That is just a pituitary signal. What I want to bring into the mix a little bit is talking about the adrenals, because again, the adrenals and the thyroid are each other's ride or die. Where one goes, the other one goes. You cannot separate the two. And I'm probably, the hill that I'm going to stand on and defend is that 99% of the time, it's an adrenal issue first and a thyroid problem second. And the reason I say that is, well, first of all, the adrenals are the first responders to stress. They're the ultimate stress handling glands. They, like the thyroid, they have to do with our metabolism. They have an influence on digestion, blood sugar, immune system. Let's see, what else am I thinking? Mood, energy. They can impact our reproductive hormones as well. So they have this huge influence in the body, very much like the thyroid. And the truth is, you really can't live without either gland. And if they're gone, you have to replace them with the hormones. Thyroid, on one hand, is very simple. It's just thyroid hormones. Most people are just put on T4, even if they don't have their thyroid gland. Some people without a gland will be put on T4 and T3. Pretty straightforward. Your adrenals, on the other hand, produce way more hormones. They produce epinephrine, norepinephrine, sometimes called adrenaline, noradrenaline. That is produced in the adrenal medulla. There's two parts to the adrenals. And in the adrenal cortex is where predominantly we think of cortisol and DHEA. But we also make all our other intermediary hormones in that steroid hormone family, either through precursor or just small amounts. That's testosterone, androstenedione, all the estrogens, progesterone, all of those are made in the adrenal glands. So now you start to appreciate the complexity of that gland, those two little glands that sit on top of the kidneys. So they're kind of central to what's going on in the endocrine system, at least compared to the thyroid and the ovaries. It's kind of right in the middle. So knowing that they are the stress handling glands, and also that the hypothalamus has the highest sensitivity to stress and to cortisol, you can also see why they become pretty important, which means, going back to the communication, if this is a stress response and we got corticotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, going to the anterior pituitary, it's going to stimulate TSH, ACTH, as well as prolactin. Now, part of this is that, when prolactin goes up, it suppresses dopamine. So there's the impact of in particular, anxiety, right? And then, of course, just imbalances that might accrue over cortisol, DHEA, or just the influx of adrenaline, noradrenaline can also affect our mood, make us feel anxious and different things like that. But it's a necessary thing because adrenaline and noradrenaline have to come first. And then that stimulates the production of cortisol and DHEA because it's not just sitting around already pre-made. But now we've got to talk about the TSH. So it's also very, very possible and also very common that I've seen in my practice where TSH will be elevated in a little and sometimes quite a bit. But the view of the thyroid itself, meaning all the thyroid hormones, total T4, free T4, reverse T3, free T3, all of them are in optimal range. And I'm not talking lab reference range that just is catching pathology. I mean optimal. But yet I got a TSH that's elevated. I'm going, well, that wouldn't make sense, right? If they're doing their job, you'd have to go, well, why is the thyroid yelling at me? Except TSH will elevate because this is a stress response. So you never, ever, ever want to just assume or just look at TSH and go, oh, this is my thyroid, because the truth is the primary issue could be the adrenals. And I see this as where oftentimes people get put on thyroid medicine, like anything, you're giving something, for a minute, you feel better at first, And then you sort of plateau and you go, oh, it must be my thyroid. I just need more. But every time you increase that thyroid medicine, you are stressing the adrenals more because they have to try to keep up with what the thyroid's doing. So in essence, by not recognizing the adrenals and supporting them, you actually make them worse. You make that adrenal situation worse over time. Now, the interesting thing though is with this is that a lot of what can go on can look very similar when the adrenals aren't happy. The weight gain, the insulin resistance, the hair loss, the profound fatigue, the mood issues. There's a lot of overlap. And while I will always say your symptoms matter, you have to understand then what the symptoms are trying to tell us. You cannot make choices based on symptoms alone. We need to understand what's really happening in the body. And to be fair, sometimes it's both. The thyroid and the adrenals are kind of in trouble, and then that can guide me towards, maybe certain herbs that I might use where it's thyroid and adrenals versus just adrenals. Now, the adrenals are kind of similar in their nutritional need. I mean, the zinc, the B vitamins, the minerals like magnesium also needs calcium, little bit of iron, not as much as like the thyroid, but they shine because they need a lot more vitamin C because the adrenal glands are the highest storage site of vitamin C in the body. So when we think of recovery, we want to think of whole food vitamin C and things like that. But the nice part is that when you're doing really good whole food nutrition, you are, there's no way you're not supporting this whole body, this whole endocrine system, and certainly the thyroid and the adrenals. Okay. You guys are still with me, I hope. So we're 20 minutes in. So let's keep going just a little bit more and to kind of wrap up today's podcast. So the next part I want to think about is the fact. So we talked about thyroid, talked about adrenals. Now I want to talk about this. And I'm going to say, I don't want to call it insane, but it feels a little bit crazy to me of the conversation of women thinking they're in their 30s, they're in perimenopause. They're 40, they're in perimenopause, and menopause ideally hits about 51 to 55. In a pretty healthy individual, perimenopause would only be 2 to 3 years before menopause, meaning you only have a couple years before that last period happens. If you're in your early 40s, you're in your 30s, not saying that you can't have irregularity in your cycle, but rather than thinking that it's because the ovaries are suddenly quieting down, I really want you to think of the role of the adrenals. And this ties back into the prolactin that rises in a stress response, as well as it can with the thyroid, but in particular in that stress response. It goes up, it can alter FSH and LH, which means it can affect the corpus luteum. It can affect ovulation, so you may not ovulate, or you may not maintain your progesterone in the second half of the cycle, making PMS worse, maybe making your cycle heavier, shorter, throwing all sorts of, wrenches into this whole system. But the primary thing is coming back to a good stress response. So when the stress response isn't healthy or we get stuck in a prolonged stress response, this is going to affect our ovaries. And I have historically found that if I really give good support, especially to the adrenals, I don't need to support the reproductive hormones as much because they will naturally balance out as the adrenals strengthen and become more resilient. And that is such a key thing to get, because what you think of as strictly imbalances of estrogen and progesterone could also look like imbalances within the adrenals. And given enough dysregulation, it'll also show up as part of the thyroid as well. And I think it's just good because, there's, we don't want to make any gland the bad guy. We don't want to make any hormone the bad guy. It's always about this endocrine family functioning well together and hormones that are in balance with each other and function together as well. That is really the key to our overall vitality. It's our key from a cycling female to going through kind of like reverse puberty as things start to change in that couple years of perimenopause before our period ends, and then it ends. But you can't blame everything on perimenopause, hot flashes and night sweats, because I'm going to tell you, men get it. Men get it. They get it in their 20s. I see women in their 20s having it. Men get it in their 30s. They can also get it in their 40s. This is coming to a bigger imbalance that is happening within the steroid hormone family. And men, their gonads are pretty much all they produce is testosterone. You can have hormone conversion via enzyme pathways, but again, what's going to hijack that is going to be chronic and prolonged stress. So to summarize, and I'll come back to another more kind of diving in a little bit more on the next podcast. But when we think about this one, think that your thyroid is not your TSH. It is just a communication to the thyroid gland. But also keep in mind, it's not just TSH that will elevate, whether it's thyroid and or adrenals. You're going to have other pituitary hormones that elevate, such as ACTH and prolactin. They can also thereby influence or suppress FSH, LH, which in turn can affect growth hormone. It is important to see the body as a whole. It's really important not to cherry pick a particular hormone as a good guy or the bad guy, and not to cherry pick a gland either. We want to gracefully transition into menopause. We're not trying to prolong it, but balance oftentimes is going to heavily lie into where the adrenals are at. And I'll say this, if the adrenals aren't happy, nobody's happy. It disrupts everything in the body, every system. Okay. I think that's it. We want to have, now I just really quick, and this is kind of overall endocrine. And I just need to keep saying this. We need to get our sleep. Women need at the minimum 7 hours. Well, everybody needs at least 7 hours of total sleep. Women need probably closer to 8 to 9 hours. We have to have a healthy microbiome. I cannot stress that enough. We have to have good gut function, which means you got to have healthy poops every day. You got to be able to digest your food. It doesn't show up in your stool, but you got a healthy poop every day. Not excessive bloating, not excessive gas. Because if there's an intimate connection between your gut and your immune system and also your endocrine system. Again, nothing is alone. Everything works together. Make sure that, kind of in that gut component, we have good blood sugar stability, that we're not actually getting too low. Too low will create an alarm, create a stressor in the body, which will cause cortisol to surge, antagonize insulin, all this really kind of nasty stuff. So good blood sugar control, which can happen when we prioritize our protein and fiber and enough healthy fats and carbohydrates to make it interesting, and to really watch the excessive refined carbohydrates and obviously, simple sugars and so forth. I think when it comes to the lifestyle aspect is we want to exercise enough. It makes our muscles strong. It boosts our metabolism, but pay attention to how you feel. Excessive exercise can stress cortisol and cause weight gain and insulin resistance because it's also causing inflammation. But being too sedentary isn't good either. It's a little bit of a Goldilocks scenario, right? Like the porridge has to be just right. And that's how we really want to think about our exercise and our movement in there. And don't forget having joy, do something that's fun, whether that is dancing, if you like to read a book, do some things, and also maybe try to learn some new things that are great for your brain. Maybe you want to meditate. Maybe you want to do a walking meditation. Maybe you want to listen to music. Maybe you want to read your Bible. I don't care, but we need to do things that nourish our brain, nourish our soul, however you want to see it, because that helps us with our being more resilient. And I really love that word, that resiliency that I want. I'm going to age, but man, I can do it in a more resilient way that leads me into having way more vitality. All right. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Hormone Hackers. And please stay tuned for more episodes to come.